They thought they could push me into silence. The HOA had taken what wasn't theirs, trampling over years of my hard work and leaving me with nothing but anger and a choice. I could roll over like they expected, or I could make sure they felt every ounce of the damage they caused. When the moment finally came, the entire neighborhood watched in disbelief as their empire of control began to crumble. But how far would I have to go to take back what was mine? And would they survive the lesson I was about to teach them? At first, life in the neighborhood felt like a dream. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges. Children played freely on the sidewalks, and every home looked picture perfect. For someone like Daniel, who had worked years to afford a piece of stability for his family, it felt like the reward he had been waiting for. His backyard overlooked a quiet stretch of woods. His morning started with coffee on the porch, and for a while, the HOA seemed like nothing more than a background detail, a board of people who sent newsletters and hosted holiday events. But behind the glossy appearances, cracks were forming. The board's rules grew longer each month, and whispers about enforcing community standards became louder at every meeting. Small notices began showing up on doorsteps. A fine for grass that was too long, a warning about leaving trash bins out a few minutes past collection time. Neighbors who once waved in passing now exchanged nervous glances, careful not to draw the board's attention. Daniel brushed it off at first. After all, he wasn't the type to break rules. Yet the tension was there, just under the surface, waiting for its chance to explode. And when the HOA finally turned its sights on him, the illusion of peace would shatter in ways no one in the neighborhood was prepared for. At first, Daniel thought the HOA's rules were nothing more than overzealous nitpicking. But within weeks, the board's attention turned sharply toward him, and the notices started piling up. The first was a warning about his mailbox. According to the HOA, the shade of paint he had used, barely distinguishable from the approved color, was out of compliance. He was ordered to repaint it immediately or face a fine. Daniel laughed it off, thinking it was a mistake, but the letter carried a seriousness that was hard to ignore. The deadline gave him only 3 days to correct the violation. Then came the second notice. His grass was 1 inch over the community standard. Daniel had been out of town for a work trip, and his lawn service had missed a week. It didn't matter. The HOA fined him $75. It was irritating, but still manageable, until the board escalated. Weeks later, Daniel received a formal letter accusing him of unauthorized landscaping. He had planted a row of rose bushes along the back fence, a personal touch to bring life to the yard. According to the HOA, this was a violation because he hadn't submitted an architectural modification request. They demanded he remove the bushes immediately or face a $250 fine per week. Daniel couldn't believe it. This was his yard, his property. Yet every effort to challenge the decision was met with silence or vague, condescending replies from the board. Still, it wasn't just about plants or paint. The HOA was making an example of him. Every week, another notice appeared. Sometimes the violations were absurd. Patio furniture not in compliance, holiday decorations exceeding time limits, even a claim that his driveway was improperly edged. The message was clear. No matter what he did, they would find fault. The pressure didn't stop at paper. One afternoon, Daniel returned home to find an HOA inspector standing in his backyard, clipboard in hand. He hadn't given permission for anyone to enter. When Daniel confronted him, the man coolly replied that the HOA had the right to ensure compliance. Daniel's anger boiled, but the inspector simply wrote down another violation and walked away. Neighbors began to notice, too. Some offered quiet words of sympathy, admitting they had been through the same treatment, but were too afraid to fight back. Others avoided him altogether, as though being friendly with Daniel might draw the HOA's ire onto them. The once friendly community had turned into a place of suspicion, where everyone watched their step. The fines kept adding up. Within a few months, Daniel owed thousands of dollars, money he didn't have. The HOA sent threats of placing a lien on his home, a reminder that in their eyes, he could lose everything. That was the moment it hit him. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. The board was testing how far they could push, how much they could take before he broke. But Daniel wasn't ready to break. Instead, he started documenting everything. Every notice, every photo, every absurd rule they twisted against him. He went to meetings, only to be silenced by the board's smug chairperson, who smirked as she told him his time was up. Still, he wrote down every word, every exchange. And slowly, he began to notice patterns. The same board members who fined him for unauthorized landscaping had approved their friends' projects without paperwork. The same people who hounded him over grass length had yards in worse condition. Hypocrisy dripped from every corner of the HOA, and Daniel realized this wasn't incompetence. It was targeted harassment. Then came the breaking point. One morning, Daniel awoke to find construction equipment rolling across the edge of his land. At first, he thought it was a mistake, but within hours, workers were pouring concrete on his property. The HOA had approved an expansion project that pushed deep into the strip of land he owned, claiming it was common space. They never asked him. They never offered compensation. They simply took it. Daniel stood there, stunned, watching as bulldozers chewed into the earth he had paid for, maintained, and cherished. He shouted at the foreman, demanded to see paperwork, but was brushed off with the same rehearsed line. The HOA approved this. That night, he barely slept. Every glance out the window showed another chunk of his land disappearing, swallowed by concrete slabs and the skeletons of new homes. The HOA wasn't just fining him anymore. They were stealing from him in plain sight. And with each passing day, his anger grew heavier. The board didn't care about rules, fairness, or community. They cared about power, money, and the thrill of breaking someone who dared to resist. By the end of the week, Daniel knew one thing. They had pushed too far. They had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. What the HOA didn't realize was that he still held the one thing they had overlooked, the dam. The land they were so eager to build on sat just downstream of it. And while the board thought they controlled every detail of his life, they had no idea what kind of power he was quietly preparing to unleash. The HOA thought they had won. But in their arrogance, they had built their empire on fragile ground, and Daniel was about to show them just how quickly it could all wash away. Daniel had endured months of fines, threats, and humiliation. He had watched as the HOA bulldozed his land, poured concrete over ground that was rightfully his, and mocked his attempts to fight back. But what the board didn't realize was that while they were busy tightening their grip, he was gathering every scrap of leverage he had left. The night before the showdown, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, papers spread across the surface. Photographs of violations the board ignored, emails where they contradicted themselves, property surveys proving where his land began and ended. But even with all the evidence, he knew the board wouldn't back down willingly. They had built their power on intimidation, and they weren't about to give it up in a polite meeting. So Daniel made a choice. If they wanted a war, he was going to bring it right to their doorstep. The next HOA meeting was packed. Neighbors crowded into the small clubhouse, the air thick with unease. Some came out of loyalty, some out of curiosity, but most came because they wanted to see what would happen when Daniel finally confronted the board. The chairwoman, smug as ever, opened the meeting with her usual condescending tone, rattling off rules and fines as if nothing could touch her authority. And then Daniel stood. He carried a stack of binders in his arms, dropping them onto the table with a heavy thud that made the entire room flinch. Every head turned as he spoke, not with anger, but with a calm, steady voice that cut sharper than a shout. For months, this board has claimed to be the guardians of community standards, he began, his eyes fixed on the chairwoman. But what you've really been doing is abusing your power, targeting homeowners you don't like, and lining your pockets while the rest of us suffer. A murmur swept the room. The board members shifted uncomfortably, but the chairwoman sneered. "Mr. Walker, your time is limited. You'll need to." "No," Daniel interrupted, slamming a photograph onto the table. "You'll need to explain this." It was a picture of the vice chair's backyard, overgrown, cluttered with junk, completely out of compliance. Gasps filled the room. Another photo followed, a board member's unauthorized shed, one that had been quietly approved without paperwork. Then another, and another, each one revealing the hypocrisy the board had tried to bury. This is what you call fair enforcement. Daniel's voice rose, his calmness giving way to the fury he'd held back for months. You fine me for rose bushes, but let your friends build whatever they want. You call my grass too long, while you ignore yards like these. And you claim my land is common space, but here's the survey, stamped by the county, proving otherwise. He held the document high, the seal catching the fluorescent lights. The neighbors leaned forward, whispering, some nodding in agreement, others staring at the board with wide, angry eyes. The chairwoman tried to regain control, banging the gavel, her voice cracking as she demanded silence. But for the first time, her authority wasn't working. The crowd wasn't listening to her. They were listening to him. And then Daniel delivered the final blow. He pulled out a flash drive and slid it across the table. Contained here are emails obtained through a records request, showing that this board knowingly approved construction on land that wasn't theirs to give. You authorized builders to cross onto my property, to pour concrete and frame houses without consent. That's not a violation. That's theft. The room erupted. Neighbors shouted, demanding answers. Some stood, pointing fingers at the board members who sat frozen in silence. The chairwoman's face drained of color, her lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. Daniel leaned forward, his voice dropping low but carrying across the chaos. You didn't just cross a line, you bulldozed it. And now, you'll answer for it. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The board members whispered among themselves, desperation in their voices, but the damage was done. The neighbors had seen too much. The illusion of control the HOA had clung to was shattered, and in its place was outrage. But Daniel wasn't finished. He looked out at the sea of faces, the people who had once been silent, afraid, beaten down by the same system that had nearly destroyed him. You don't have to live like this anymore, he said. You don't have to bow to their every demand, pay their every fine, or fear their retaliation. You have the power to vote them out, to take back your community, and to hold them accountable for every lie they've told. The neighbors erupted into applause, the sound deafening inside the small clubhouse. For the first time, Daniel saw hope flicker in their eyes. They weren't just bystanders anymore. They were ready to fight. The chairwoman slammed the gavel again, her voice shrill as she declared the meeting adjourned. But the crowd ignored her. The board members slunk from their seats, their once arrogant faces pale with the realization that they had lost control. As they fled, Daniel stood tall, the weight of months of abuse lifting from his shoulders. But even as he felt a surge of vindication, he knew the battle wasn't over. The homes on his land were still there. The damage couldn't be undone with a meeting alone. The board had been humiliated, yes, but they were cornered animals now, desperate to claw back whatever power they could. And Daniel knew cornered animals could still be dangerous. He stepped out into the night, the cool air hitting his face as the clubhouse buzzed with the energy of neighbors finally awake to the truth. For the first time, the HOA wasn't the one holding the power. But as Daniel looked toward the horizon, where construction lights glowed against the darkness, he understood one thing clearly. The war had only just begun. In the days after the explosive meeting, the neighborhood didn't feel the same. What was once a place of silence and fear had transformed almost overnight into a hive of whispers, hushed conversations on porches, and small groups of neighbors exchanging copies of the evidence Daniel had revealed. For the first time in years, people were no longer afraid to question the HOA's authority. They had seen the cracks in the board's armor, and the illusion of absolute control had finally shattered. The board, on the other hand, was reeling. The chairwoman, who once strutted into meetings with an air of untouchable confidence,